Something just happened in Formula One that could change the entire 2026 championship, and most fans almost missed it. Right after the Australian Grand Prix, Ferrari revealed a rear wing so extreme that rival teams immediately started questioning the rules. A system that does not simply open like traditional drag reduction systems. It rotates, almost flipping its aerodynamic profile when the car hits the straight. And engineers estimate that movement could unlock between 8 and 10 km per hour of extra top speed. In Formula One, that kind of advantage is massive. It means easier overtakes, stronger defense, and a completely different race strategy. But here is where the story becomes explosive. The moment Ferrari confirmed the SF-26 would bring this Macarena rear wing to the Chinese Grand Prix, several teams reacted instantly. Technical meetings began. Questions were sent to the FIA. And according to paddock insiders, Mercedes quickly moved to the front of a growing revolt against Ferrari's design. Because if this system works exactly the way Ferrari expects, the SF-26 could suddenly become the fastest car on every long straight in Formula One. And the detail that triggered all of this is connected to something that happened during the Australian Grand Prix, a moment almost nobody noticed. But the moment that moment from Australia was analyzed properly, the entire story began to change. Because during the race in Melbourne, Ferrari looked strong. Very strong. The SF-26 launched aggressively from the start. The car showed excellent traction out of slower corners. Through medium speed sections, it looked stable, predictable, almost perfectly balanced. Charles Leclerc was pushing confidently. Lewis Hamilton, in his first season with Ferrari, looked surprisingly comfortable inside the car. For many fans watching the broadcast, Ferrari already looked like a genuine contender. But engineers were not watching the race the same way. They were studying the data. Every straight, every acceleration zone, every energy deployment phase. And that is where something interesting appeared. Ferrari was fast. Very fast. But on the longest straights of the circuit, another car still had a slight advantage. Mercedes. Not a huge margin. Nothing dramatic on television. But enough to appear clearly in the telemetry. And in Formula One, small advantages repeated lap after lap become extremely important. A few extra kilometers per hour at the end of every straight changes overtaking opportunities. It changes defensive strategy. It changes how teams deploy electrical energy during a race. Ferrari engineers understood the implication immediately. Their car had excellent corner performance, strong traction, solid race pace. But on circuits with long straights, they still needed more efficiency, less drag, more speed. And that realization triggered a decision inside Maranello that surprised several teams in the paddock. Because Ferrari already had a radical solution waiting. A concept they had quietly tested earlier in the year during the Bahrain tests. At the time, most teams believed it was simply an experimental prototype. Interesting, yes, but probably too extreme to use so early in the season. But after analyzing the Australian data, Ferrari changed the plan. They accelerated the development schedule. They prepared several versions of the system. And they decided to bring the Macarena rear wing to the Chinese Grand Prix. And the moment that information began circulating through the paddock, rival engineers started paying very close attention. Because if the footage and early data from testing were correct, Ferrari's new rear wing was not just another upgrade. It was something that could change how the entire grid fights on the straights. But the real shock inside the paddock came when engineers finally understood how Ferrari's new rear wing actually works. At first, many teams believed the nickname was just a joke. The Macarena. It sounded like something invented by journalists. Something exaggerated. Something harmless. But the moment technical images and slow-motion footage from testing began circulating between teams, the reaction changed instantly. Because Ferrari had not simply modified the rear wing. They had redesigned how the entire component behaves at high speed. In a normal Formula One system, the rear wing only opens slightly when drag reduction activates. A small slot appears. Air passes through. Drag decreases a little. Top speed increases slightly. It is effective, but controlled. Ferrari asked a very different question. What if the wing did not just open? What if it rotated? And that is exactly what they built. Instead of a small movement, the main aerodynamic plane of the wing rotates dramatically when the car enters straight line mode. Not 10 degrees. Not 20. The movement is enormous. The wing can rotate between roughly 180 degrees and nearly 270 degrees. That means the aerodynamic profile almost flips completely. In corners, the wing behaves normally. It produces strong downforce. The rear of the car stays planted, stable, predictable. But the moment the driver exits the corner and accelerates onto a straight, everything changes. The system activates. The wing rotates. Airflow reorganizes across the entire rear of the car. And the most important effect appears immediately. Drag almost disappears. Engineers inside the paddock began describing the system using two simple terms: corner mode and flight mode. Because when the wing rotates into straight configuration, it almost produces lift instead of downforce, dramatically reducing aerodynamic resistance. The result is exactly what Ferrari was chasing: speed. And a lot of speed. Early technical estimates suggest the concept could deliver between 8 and 10 km per hour more top speed compared with more conservative active wing systems. In Formula One, that difference is massive. It can decide overtakes before drivers even reach the braking zone. It can allow a driver to attack while using less electrical energy. And it can make defending almost impossible for the car ahead. But the moment rival engineers realized how aggressive the rotation actually was, the conversation inside the paddock changed. Because the question was no longer just about performance. It became a question about the rules. The 2026 regulations allow active aerodynamics. That part is clear. Front wings and rear wings can change configuration between corner mode and straight mode. But Ferrari's interpretation pushes that concept much further than most teams expected. Much further. And that is exactly where Mercedes stepped into the center of the discussion. Because Mercedes engineers immediately understood the potential consequences. If Ferrari truly reduced drag more aggressively than anyone else, the advantage of a powerful engine and efficient energy deployment could suddenly become much smaller. Imagine the situation. A Mercedes exits the final corner slightly ahead of a Ferrari. Normally, that position would be safe. But if the Ferrari suddenly gains several extra kilometers per hour halfway down the straight, the overtake becomes almost inevitable. And once engineers started calculating that scenario, concern began spreading across the grid. Because if the Macarena wing works exactly as Ferrari expects, the advantage will not only appear in China. It could become a weapon on several circuits. Monza, Baku, Las Vegas, Spa. Any track with long straights suddenly becomes extremely dangerous for Ferrari's rivals. And that is why Mercedes began asking the FIA a very important question. Not whether the idea is clever, but whether the rules were ever meant to allow something this extreme. And this is the exact moment when the story stopped being purely technical and started becoming political. Because in Formula One, whenever a team introduces a radical innovation, two battles begin at the same time. The battle on the track. And the battle behind closed doors. When Mercedes engineers fully understood how Ferrari's Macarena rear wing behaved, they immediately realized something important. This was not just another clever aerodynamic tweak. It was a completely different philosophy. For years, Mercedes built its competitive advantage around efficiency. A powerful hybrid system. Extremely refined energy deployment. And aerodynamic stability across different circuits. In Australia, that formula looked strong. The Mercedes cars showed impressive efficiency on the straights. Their energy deployment was smooth, precise, very controlled. But Ferrari's new concept threatened to attack that advantage directly. Because if Ferrari could erase drag more aggressively than anyone else, the benefit of Mercedes' efficient power unit suddenly becomes smaller. Much smaller. Imagine the situation. A Mercedes exits the final corner just ahead of a Ferrari. Normally, that position would be safe. The Mercedes driver defends the inside line. The straight arrives. And the following car struggles to close the gap. But if Ferrari's rear wing suddenly switches into what engineers call flight mode, the situation changes completely. The Ferrari begins gaining speed. Meter after meter. The gap disappears. The braking zone arrives. And the overtake becomes inevitable. That possibility is exactly what worried rival engineers. Because the predicted advantage of 8 to 10 km per hour is not small. In Formula One terms, it is enormous. It changes overtaking dynamics. It changes battery deployment strategy. And it can transform how drivers control a race. But the concern inside Mercedes was not only about performance. It was also about how the system behaves structurally. Because when a rear wing rotates through such a large angle, engineers immediately start thinking about something very sensitive in Formula One. Aeroelasticity. That is when aerodynamic forces slightly deform parts of the car at high speed. Sometimes the deformation is tiny. Almost invisible. But even a small flex can change how air flows across the car. And Formula One has seen this story before. Flexible wings. Moving floors. Front wings bending under load. Every generation of regulations eventually discovers a gray area. So when Ferrari's Macarena wing began circulating through technical discussions, several teams started asking deeper questions. How stable is the wing at maximum speed? Does it behave exactly the same under aerodynamic load? Could it flex slightly during the rotation phase? Those questions do not automatically mean the system is illegal. But they place the design right on the edge of the rulebook. And whenever a design sits on that edge, the paddock reacts quickly. Teams begin talking to the FIA. Technical clarifications are requested. And discussions begin about whether the interpretation of the rules matches the intention of the regulations. According to several paddock insiders, Mercedes quickly became one of the teams pushing those conversations forward. Not a formal protest. Not an official accusation. But a growing series of technical questions. Because if Ferrari's interpretation is correct, other teams may need to redesign their own rear wings. And if it is not, the FIA may need to define new limits for how active aerodynamic systems are allowed to move. That is exactly why the Chinese Grand Prix suddenly became such an important moment. Shanghai is one of the most revealing circuits on the calendar when it comes to aerodynamic efficiency. The lap begins with long sweeping corners that demand strong downforce. But later comes the famous back straight. More than a kilometer of full throttle acceleration. Drivers remain flat out for several seconds. And during those seconds, aerodynamic drag becomes the single most important factor on the car. If Ferrari's Macarena wing truly enters flight mode on that straight, the SF-26 could suddenly appear much faster than its rivals. And if that happens, the reaction from Mercedes and the rest of the grid could become much louder.